Hi there, I'm John.
And I'm Rex.
And we're the Weird Cities Podcast. We do amateur studies of cities in speculative and weird fiction. And today we're going to do a mutual favorite of ours, the cities of Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborea.
Commorium and Uzuldaroum.
Both of these cities are the most prominent ones in this setting. We'll elaborate a bit about these cities and some of their backstory. Hyperborea takes place in a fictional ice age and civilizations that were buried under the advancing glaciers. It was one of Clark Ashton Smith's prominent fantasy cycles, and it was published in the Weird Tales magazine in the 1930s, in part of the golden age of pulp. Some of the main stories that we're using for our inspiration are The Testament of Athaeus, The Tale of Satrapazeros, and The Theft of the 39 Girls. We also touch on a couple of other ones, such as the White Sibyl, The Coming of the White Worm, and the Weird of Uzuldaroum. And we'd like to start off with a bit about Commorium and the original capital or prominent city of Hyperborea. Commorium was essentially the hub of an empire, or the most prominent of the city-states of Hyperborea. It was located about a day's ride from the Iglothian Mountains, and there would be a doom that would befall this city, and a new capital, Uzuldaroum, would be founded about a day's ride to the south, about 20 or 30 miles by horse. So, based upon these stories, we've constructed a rough chronology and a bit of extrapolation about the institutions, society, and happenings of both of these cities. Now, due to their central location, these cities would naturally benefit from being trade hubs. But what exactly are they trading there, Rex?
They're probably trading a lot of fruits and vegetables and gems, spices, powders, that kind of thing. A lot of things that old world cultures would exchange.
As we mentioned before, these cities are set in a fictional, Iron or Bronze Age culture. Clark Ashton Smith took some liberties with the climate of Hyperborea, so it's essentially a jungle full of dinosaurs and mammoths and other prehistoric creatures, plus fictional creatures called wormies that are descended from the great old ones of Thagwa.
Yeah, and they're very hairy subhuman types.
Yes, and not very nice either. So, the capital of this continent is Commorium, for lack of a better place, and it's essentially a monarchy. There's the king, who's the executive branch, but there is an independent judiciary. Sentences tend to be fairly harsh, we imagine, because in Testament of Athaeus, one of the main stories we're using, it's told from the point of view of the headsman, the guy who chops off heads. As he mentions, he has to do his trade multiple times a day. So, there also, interestingly, is an independent judiciary of 8 judges. They all pronounce the sentences, as well as the king, before anyone gets their head chopped off, or whatever else gets chopped off. Some historical inspirations could be like the Code of Hammurabi, or similarly draconian measures. But, interestingly, there is one fellow that poor Athaeus can't quite execute as much as he tries, and we'll go into the specifics a bit later, but a new capital is set up to the far south, or, the recent relatively close south, about 30 miles, a day's ride, but based upon the events of the story, I'd rather it be a little bit farther. How about you, Rex?
Yeah, they should probably not be on the same continent.
Yeah, especially given, we'll let you guys find out. But the new city, like the old one, they're both very opulent, they're both very, elaborate and ornate, and there's, evidence in the story of very ornate and in-depth and precise urban planning, because in Satrapazeros, the main thief, Satrapazeros, and his buddy Tiroff decide to go loot some old temples in what was once Commorium. So they find, this particular temple, the Fane of Thagwa, that looks like it's made of black basalt. It's got quinquangular, or 5-sided flagstones, as its dominant features. It looks really crude and early compared to some of the earlier stuff, but it's essentially alongside a bunch of other temples that look a bit more recent, but everything here looks in a fairly good state of preservation despite the age here. We're presuming that at least a couple of decades, perhaps longer, have passed since the abandonment of Commorium. In my mind, it kind of looks like Angkor Wat, or some city that's been overtaken by the jungle.
Yeah, the implication is that Commorium was completely overrun by the jungle area, and the road that eventually leads to Uzuldaroum is likewise covered in fauna and weird creatures.
One of the interesting things is that it's described that both Uzuldaroum and Commorium have city walls, but the exact specifics of these temples, they might be a little outside the city walls. The Temple of Thagwa might actually be very old, older than the city itself, but the city is presumed to be very well laid out because they could afford urban planning. They had big avenues and ornate palaces. And because of what our poor thieving friends find inside the temple, they have to run really fast all around the ruins, and eventually they get chased back into the temple, where one of them meets an unpleasant fate, and the other one, well, he's gonna remember that encounter.
Yeah, it's gonna be a short hand in the process.
Yep. I guess you could say the thief was caught empty-handed. Wah, wah. Cue the crickets. But another interesting thing about these cities is that they both are implied to have very stringent legal systems, because in Uzuldaroum later on, our thieving main character mentions laying low, and presumably the police and city guard have learned their lessons, so to speak, so they're not putting up with a lot of his hijinks.
Yeah, there do seem to be a lot of a very present police force, at least in Uzuldaroum, and at least in the brothel area.
Here's where things get a little bit interesting. We're going to go into the gutter for a little bit while we discuss certain aspects of Uzuldaroum. Now, the religions of this city tend to be polytheistic. One of the principal gods seems to be Tsathoggua, but there is other gods as well, and all these religious orders tend to seem kind of cultish, as you'd expect from a weird tales writer. And interestingly, the religions here have become fairly large businesses as well. And one of the more notable ones in Uzuldaroum is let's just say a temple that inadvertently became the center of the red light district, as Rex will explain.
Yeah, that's the temple of Laniqua, the moon god, where various virgins, quote-unquote, are gathered and kept for at least into the age of 31, where they're promptly given the boot, and to maintain their nominal virginity. They wear these elaborate gilded girdles, which become the object of desire for our favorite thief, Satan Prazeros.
Now, one of the things about this as well is that this temple used to be such a place of ill repute that all the nobles and people of status would sneak in through a tunnel that was off of like a really remote road. But as Clark Ashton Smith so wryly notes, perhaps decency had decreased, so now they enter through the front door.
Well, he said either decency had decreased or piety had increased.
And in this religion, they tend to see the women as essentially a type of religious prostitute. Now, it's kind of implied that some of them might not be there voluntarily. For historical comparison, religious prostitution was a big thing in a lot of ancient world cultures, from Greece, Middle East, India, and so on. And what might be possible is that the 39 virgins, in quotation marks, might be the elite courtesans, essentially, or the most sought-after ones, because it's the rich people, the elite males of the city, that essentially flaunt their status by hiring these women. There's a whole lot of nasty gender and class policies here, because you essentially have rich men taking advantage of women and who have their sexuality completely dominated by a patriarchal religious institute.
Well, yeah, it's essentially religiously supported sex slavery.
Yep. And then there's also the other kind of brothels and seedy places around this temple, maybe for the people who can't quite afford to go into the temple.
Yeah, and however poor off the Niquan priestesses are, the other ones are probably worse.
Now, one of the things about this particular religion is that we kind of extrapolated that there's a male god of the moon, but what about perhaps a female sun god? Clark Ashton Smith doesn't really go into a lot of detail, but it's kind of implied that for the most part, the people of Commorium and Uzuldaroum worship a bunch of different gods, kind of like the ancient world did.
Mm-hmm.
And Rex, what about their previous main god, Tsathoggua?
Well, I'm not sure that Tsathoggua was ever a deity worshipped by the masses, but his popularity has gone up and down throughout the history of Hyperborea.
And interestingly, it's one of his temples that Satan Prazeros decides to loot. So he goes inside, he finds it looks all fancy and such. There's a two-tiered altar, a strange kind of vessel in the center of the temple in front of an idol of Tsathoggua. Tsathoggua is kind of like a big, hairy Kermit/sloth creature, and basically the slacker deity. He just sits around not doing much. But he's got this kind of critter called a formless spawn, at least according to the expanded universe material, that's sitting in the bowl there, and by touching the idol, Kirov and Satan Prazeros stir the thing up, starts chasing them around, it eats poor Kirov, and grabs Satan Prazeros' hand. But where this creature came from is fairly interesting, because what eventually happened to Commorium...
Yeah, we have some speculations about that. In the stories, there are conflicting accounts of how Commorium fell, and one theory is that it was taken by the ice after being prophesied by the White Sibyl of Polarian, but in the story The Testament of Athamas, the eponymous headsman sets us straight by telling us about a leader of a band of thieves and general marauders named Nagathan-Jaum. After picking at the surrounding areas and getting very close and doing really heinous stuff to the nearby
villages and
such, is arrested and brought to be executed. Only it doesn't quite work.
Because, unfortunately for our heroic bureaucrat, this fellow keeps coming back from the dead. Each time he comes back, his head gets cut off, but he becomes less and less human each time. And the final time, he doesn't have a head, and he ends up eating a lot of the city's major officials. So, a lot of people wisely decide to get the heck out of there. And in some of Clark Ashton Smith's notes, he notes that the creature reproduced by binary fission, and that might have been what was lying in the temple of Tsathoggua, because the outlaw was reported to be like a spawn of Tsathoggua.
Yeah, so the theory is that this formless spawn that is later encountered by Satampra is either some strange descendant of Nagathan-Jaum or possibly the man himself.
Interestingly, around the temple of Tsathoggua, even the animals are given some deference of some kind, presumably why it's kind of well preserved. But that's probably why the creature doesn't really stir until the would-be thieves decide to touch the idol.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's some protective aspect.
Interestingly, about this city as well, it has a lot of evidence of urban planning. One thing about Athameus is he's fairly well educated for a headsman. Perhaps it's because the opulence of the city is such that they could afford to educate even the guy who cuts heads off for a living. But
there's also the possibility that the hereditary nature of his role in the society.
Yes. In addition to this, he comes out as kind of a bureaucrat trying to set the record straight. Both Satampra Zeros and him narrate the stories from a first-person point of view, and there's the potential that they might be unreliable narrators.
Yeah, we get the impression that, Athameus tells us outright that he is kind of reporting with rose-tinted glasses about the grandeur of the city, and there's enough about Satampra and what we see versus what he tells us that we can assume he's boasting a little bit when he goes into all these elaborate scores he's been a part of.
And one thing about Athameus is that he basically mentions that whenever he's tried to execute this guy, he's always had a heavy guard around them. The executions takes place in the city square, which is presumably laid out with direct mathematical precision. All the entrances are guarded by city guardsmen holding pikes, tridents, and polearms of various sort, in case like the outlaw gang decides to come and raid them.
And overnight he's actually put into an underground dungeon with no other means of escape except the very top.
Yes, and he does escape. But there is kind of a darker side to Commorium's elite, because we find out that some of the magistrates tend to be rather nasty on their own, or at least do a hobby that we might consider fairly nasty, because there's these race of creatures that live in the nearby mountains called the Vormes, and the Vormes tend to be seen as subhuman monsters by the inhabitants of Commorium. So there's this one guy, Ralabar Vuz, who decides to go out on a heavily armed, quote, hunting expedition to go kill some Vormes because he's got this whole room full of Vorme pelts. What he finds isn't quite what he expected, but he does provide a good insight into what the city guard and the army might be fighting or preparing to fight, as well as their equipment. Because the main creature and antagonist of Testament of Athameus was leading a band of humans, so presumably the outlying farmlands of Commorium were raided, kind of like you'd expect a city of that size to be, so they might have to call up the army to arrest the outlaws and such. But they also might have like light infantry or hunters that would fight Vormes as well. So one thing about the city is that perhaps the average city guard might be equipped with leather, which of course would be dinosaur leather, and the elite like Ralabar Vuz might carry around like copper chainmail as it's described, and swords and such. Some of the more interesting hardware he's carrying being like a big two-handed sword, as well as later weapons like hatchets and daggers, throwing knives, and such, a buckler of mammoth hide with a spike on it. So this guy is loaded for bear, and presumably the city guard was, for all the good it does them. We know our narrators might be bluffing or at least not remembering properly, but there is some real-life basis for some of the aspects of the city, or at least our suspicions. If we base some of our assumptions on the cities of the ancient world, if we use, say, Babylon as a reference point, a nice relatively inland area, then we can assume a population of perhaps 65,000 to 80,000, perhaps a little high above that. But
these are considered fairly accurate accounts of the population for these areas at that time.
At least a few thousand years ago, Bronze Age / Early Iron Age.
Yeah, we're talking about.
Of course, when the capital of Commorium is evacuated, the population probably drops quite a bit, because whenever there's a mass migration and the city's in total disorder, even relocating down south to Uzuldaroum, we don't know if Uzuldaroum was a small village or if it was another city,
or if it was created from the ground up.
But it becomes the new home of the community. Presumably, a lot of the survivors of Commorium just had what they had on their backs, so they just ran down south as far as they could, or rode down. They might not have had a lot of supplies, so this might have led to like looting and riots and general disorder, or perhaps even civil war of some scale. The city became the successor to Commorium. It still was like elaborate enough to have the religious prostitutes with the opulent jeweled girdles.
Yeah, which, as far as the Temple of Laniqua goes, we have theorized that it might have already existed before the migration from Commorium.
We do hypothesize as well that the Temple of Hyperborea might predate both cities because it was described as cruder and simpler and something from a primordial era.
Right, and it was on the edge of a very, what we've gathered is a very finely planned out city. So we suspect that perhaps it was something put off on the side that nobody really wanted to mess with.
In the ancient world, a lot of cities would be surrounded by city walls. Inside the city walls, there might be like a military fort or a palace, a garrison, a granary, perhaps to withstand sieges.
Mm-hmm. It's very ambiguous. Smith, he refers to suburbs a number of times in the stories, and that word is used in both the term of a traditional suburb residency for just kind of middle-class types, and the implication other than that is that they might just be surrounding villages of a major city. And so both of those are kind of implied.
Interestingly, though, some of these suburbs became major parts of the city. Like in Uzuldaroum, the Temple of Laniqua became like the red light district, essentially, because of the temple. Now, a lot of the elite do hang out there for obvious purposes. Interesting thing about Commorium is that it's presumably both Commorium and Uzuldaroum, their downtowns at least, or their city centers, are set up like a grid, because there's a public square mentioned in Commorium where the executions and sentencing take place. So it's likely that, like a lot of other ancient cities, like the Harappan and Indus Valley civilizations, that they had elaborate urban planning, grids and city streets, sophisticated infrastructure rather than just sprawling mud huts. We don't quite know about Uzuldaroum, but there is mentions of like leaving the city gate, so presumably it also had a city wall, just maybe as the city center of Commorium did. Now the term suburb is, we've had some problems with that, but Nigel Zahn, the outlaw who was executed by Athameus, did mention that his men raided the suburbs and really close villages, so he's getting bold and getting close. That's probably why the city was in such a rush to execute him and make him stick. In terms of the real-life parallels, urban planning goes back as long as cities do, like from the Bronze Age, Rome, the Greek city-states. Interestingly, there's also religious prostitutes, as we mentioned earlier, like the Temple of Aphrodite in ancient Greece, which was shut down by Constantine.
That's right.
The Temple of Inanna in the Middle East. And interestingly, in the Middle East, at least the ancient Bronze Age, religious prostitution was kind of seen as a sacred thing.
The sex in general is considered sacred because it would be an expression of the earth goddess.
Also, similar things occurred in other countries, India, perhaps even early Native American cultures, but there is ample historical parallels to a lot of the stuff in both of these cities.
There are also some parallels between the clash of a civilized area and a much more kind of barbarous group.
Yeah, one of Clark Ashton Smith's contemporaries and fellow Weird Tales writer, Robert Howard, creator of Conan, he was really big into the barbarianism versus civilization theme. We can see that perhaps reflected a bit with the Vormes and perhaps the outlaw band fighting the cities of Commorium and Uzuldaroum. Perhaps even the failure of Athameus to execute the outlaw and make it stick might be seen as a shortcoming of civilization, or arguably even the thief Satsumbraziros, who is kind of a misfit in civilization, might also be seen as coming up against the corrupt institutions of civilization when he tries to steal the 39 girdles. So, thank you for joining us this week. Join us next week, where we'll be exploring barbarianism versus civilization in a bit more depth, in one of Robert Howard's Conan stories, Red Nails. What city are we going to next, Rex?
That would be Tecatl, which I believe is pretty much self-contained, and there's a kind of civil war brewing between two factions going on, and Conan stumbles into the middle of it.
Cool. Hope you see us next week, and hope you enjoy your travels to these weird cities.